Behind a crumbling wall panel in an abandoned Alabama farmhouse, they found the birth certificate, folded. The ink had nearly vanished, but 3 names remained legible. Father, mother, and husband, all the same man. That discovery never made the news. It couldn't. It was too much. What followed was even worse. A local historian traced the bloodline back 5 generations, and what she uncovered shattered her career, her health, and her will to keep digging. In 1911, a boy was born. Elijah Crowthorne was his name, raised on 200 acres of scorched clay and rusted fences. No roads in, no visitors out. By the time he was 12, he had already fathered a child. That child was his sister's daughter and would later become his wife. This is not some forgotten Southern poverty tale or a story about rural isolation. This is a story about design, a controlled breeding experiment that began before the Civil War and continued uninterrupted for over a century. Elijah wasn't the first, he was the result, the final product, a man who was his own father, brother, cousin, and nephew. The few who spoke of the Crowthorne family called them the gray folk, not for their skin, but for the way they looked at you, blank, as if nothing moved behind the eyes but blood instinct and hunger. The women married no one outside the property. The children never went to school, and year after year, the births kept happening. We're going to show you what happens when tradition turns into sickness. When family becomes a prison, when bloodlines are twisted like roots around a shallow grave, you weren't supposed to hear this story. You weren't supposed to know Elijah Crowthorne existed. But now you do. They say the Crowthorne land was cursed. But the truth is far colder than superstition. It wasn't some native burial ground or a witch's hex. It was calculated isolation, strategic generational control. The land was purchased in 1831 by a man named Thomas Crowthorne, a widowed preacher with 9 children and a violent obsession with blood purity. He believed the outside world was a spiritual infection, that only those of Crowthorne blood were worthy of God's inheritance. So he sealed them in. No neighbors, no schools, no churches beyond the one he built himself. A barn he converted into a chapel where he preached 3 times a week, sometimes more. Filled with fire, blood, and the sin of dilution were his sermons. He spoke of holy vessels and sacred flesh, his own children. He taught that the blood must never be thinned, that the line must spiral inward, not outward. When his oldest daughter reached 12, by divine revelation, she was declared ready. The following spring, she bore his son. By 1900, the Crowthorne family had lost all touch with society. No census records, no public documents, no witnesses. They became ghosts in their own country. With only one law, generations passed. Keep the blood pure. Children were raised by mothers who were also their aunts. Wives who were sisters and nieces. But Elijah, he was different. The others were quiet, dull, obedient. He was sharp, calculating, and cruel in a way the others hadn't been. Born in 1911 to a woman who had been impregnated by her father, his grandfather, brother, and uncle, Elijah learned early that pain was language. By 6, he was already beating animals with rusted tools. By 9, he'd killed one of his younger cousins with a rock to the head. They said he never flinched, just stared at the blood. No one punished him. There was no law to break, no sheriff to call. And the family, they treated it as a thinning of the herd. Only the strong could carry the line forward. This was not ignorance. This was breeding like livestock, like insects in a jar. And Elijah, he was the darkest bloom of a garden rooted in madness. By the time Elijah turned 14, he was already a father twice over. Both children were born to the same girl, Ruth, his half-sister, full cousin, and legal guardian after their mother drank lye and died screaming. Ruth was 17, her face was soft, her voice barely above a whisper, and her hands were always trembling. Some said Elijah loved her, but they didn't know what love meant on that land. Love wasn't protection. It was possession. More than he called her by name, he called her mine. And when she tried to run in the middle of the night, barefoot and bleeding, he dragged her back by her hair, down a path made of bone-white stones, left her in the crawl space for 3 days with no light, no food, no water. The family said nothing, just kept on eating supper, just kept on praying. Over the next 6 years, Ruth gave birth to 3 more of Elijah's children. All of them weak. One died at 4 months, one never walked. The last was born without eyes. Elijah took that one into the woods, said nothing when he returned. No one asked. They just quietly marked another grave with a blank stone. Something had broken inside him. Or maybe it had always been broken, passed down like a cursed heirloom. But now the cracks were visible. He started hearing voices, not whispers, but commands telling him to fix the blood, saying it was tainted, that he had to purify what Thomas had started a century ago. He became obsessed with their family ledger. A book kept in a locked iron box beneath the floorboards of the barn. Every birth, every union, every sin. It read like a genetic maze. Names repeated, ages erased, genders switched when inconvenient. But Elijah read it like scripture. One winter night, after weeks of silence, Elijah emerged from the barn and announced he would marry his daughter Sarah. She was 12. When Ruth objected, he didn't speak. He simply stared at her for a long time, then left. That night, the barn caught fire. They never found Ruth's body. The family accepted it as God's will. Elijah said nothing, but he started wearing Ruth's wedding ring on a leather string around his neck. That was the moment the rest of them knew something old and evil had awakened, and it wore Elijah's face. After the wedding, Sarah never spoke again. The family called it a holy silence, a sign of divine submission. But the neighbors, what few remained within 20 miles, whispered a different theory, that her mind had simply snapped. That somewhere deep inside her, the scream never stopped. There was no ceremony, no music, just Elijah standing at the pulpit in the ash-blackened barn, reciting verses from a leather-bound Bible rewritten in his own hand. Verses he'd altered, twisted, turned into justification. He placed the ring on her finger, his mother's ring, his sister's ring, his wife's ring, and pronounced her his blood, his bride, his breath. Within a year, Sarah's belly swelled. The child was born without a jaw. It lived for 2 days. Elijah buried it under the oak tree, the same place he had buried the rest. There were no more markers now, just soil darkened with the weight of too many secrets. That year, something shifted. The crops failed. The livestock died without reason. A sickness spread through the house, a slow and cruel wasting. But Elijah only grew stronger, like he fed on the death around him. His hair turned gray before 30. His eyes grew pale, and he started preaching again, not just to the family, but to the woods, to the wind, to something no one else could see. He claimed he had visions of the original patriarch, Thomas, speaking to him through fire and bone, telling him that the family had drifted, that the line must be corrected, that there was new flesh to be made. So Elijah began. Choosing, deciding who could breed, who must remain pure, who needed to be removed. He sterilized his own niece with a hot iron blade, starved a cousin to death for confessing attraction to an outsider, and when one of the boys tried to leave, snuck off into the night, made it 3 miles before collapsing from hunger. Elijah nailed his feet to the floor of the barn and left him to die. No one intervened. By now, the family no longer saw him as a man. He had become something more or less. To them, he was a god of rot, blood, and silence. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments what you would have done if this was your bloodline. It wasn't law enforcement that finally came. It wasn't child services or a federal raid. It was a storm. A black wall-mouthed thing that tore through the valley in the spring of 1947. Lightning struck the barn and the house in the same hour. Trees fell like they were pushed, and the creek that had always run dry suddenly surged, flooding the lower fields where the graves were hidden. Bones surfaced, tiny ones. That was when the state took notice. A surveyor found the remains. Skulls too small to be adult, jawbones shattered, ribs bundled in unnatural clusters. He reported it. Within a week, officials arrived. But the family was gone. The house was empty. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just silence. And on the wall of what had once been the master bedroom, words were burned into the plaster. The line returns to the soil. They never found Elijah. They searched 6 counties. Searched caves, wells, burnt-out cellars. Nothing. Not a fingerprint, not a scrap of cloth, only stories. And those stories grew darker with every telling. Locals said the gray folk weren't gone, just underground, that Elijah had led them into the caves, the old limestone labyrinths beneath the hills, that he'd prepared them for years, dug chambers, stocked food, lit fires that never went out, and that once inside they sealed the exits. Some believe they're still down there breeding, feeding, dying, and returning. A closed loop of cursed flesh. Others claim Elijah was seen decades later walking the edge of the woods near Huntsville. Older, paler, but unmistakable. One park ranger swore he heard crying echo from a cave mouth in 1972. When he followed it in, he found a pile of children's shoes. Dozens, no prints, no bones, just shoes. He quit that same night. And then there are the families, scattered now, who carry the name Crowthorne in silence, who have no family photos, no history, just a box in the attic they never open. A ledger passed down, pages missing, names crossed out, bloodlines twisted like rope. Sometimes the truth doesn't disappear. It just sinks into the roots, waiting to bloom again. Years passed and the story faded like a bruise beneath the skin of America. No headlines, no documentaries, just a few whispers in university archives and private letters no one wants to claim. But there was one man who couldn't let it go. In 1994, a genealogist named Daniel Heron started tracing obscure bloodlines for a private history project funded by a reclusive family in New England. He didn't expect to find anything unusual until he stumbled on a pattern that chilled him to his bones. Entire branches of a single southern lineage had no external connections, no marriages beyond their own surname. Every generation had interwoven names, overlapping birth years, and an unnatural cluster of congenital defects. At the center of the pattern was one name appearing again and again. E. Crowthorne, sometimes as a father, sometimes as a husband. Once, shockingly, as both. The further he dug, the more he realized he was not building a family tree. He was unraveling a noose. Daniel drove to Alabama, traced the original homestead using old land deeds. Found it overgrown, swallowed by vines and silence. But the barn was still there, collapsed on one side, blackened with age, but standing. And beneath the altar stone, he found it. A rusted box sealed shut with wire and tar. He pried it open. Inside, pages brittle and yellow. The family ledger. What he read was worse than folklore. Detailed accounts of unions, breedings, punishments, a list of every child born, defects noted in the margins like crop failures, and at the bottom of every page in Elijah's handwriting, one phrase repeated over and over. Correct the line. Daniel tried to publish. No one would touch it. He sent copies to historians, journalists, even law enforcement. Nothing. Just silence. 6 months later, Daniel disappeared. His apartment was untouched, his notes gone. The only thing left behind was a photo. 2 mailed anonymously to a former colleague. In it, Daniel stood in front of a weathered stone marked only with the letter E. The photo was dated 2 days after he vanished. And in the background, just beyond the stone, barely visible, a pale figure stood in the tree lean, watching. They never identified the figure in the photo. Analysts enhanced it, brightened, zoomed. Still, the shape remained elusive, tall, thin, draped in something long and dark. But one thing stood out. The eyes, reflective, animal-like, the kind that don't glow from light, but from within. After Daniel vanished, those who had received his documents began to suffer strange misfortunes. One historian lost her hearing overnight. Another developed a neurological condition that stripped her of language. One man, an archivist, burned every page Daniel had sent and then hanged himself in his garage. No note, just the word "rooted" carved into the wall behind him. The legend of Elijah Crowthorne went underground again, but it never died. In small online corners, forums hidden from the surface web, people began posting fragments, photographs of ancient ledgers, audio recordings of distorted voices, genealogies with glaring black gaps, all pointing to one conclusion. The bloodline didn't vanish. It adapted. And now the question remains, where are they? If Elijah's doctrine survived, even in pieces, who carries it now? Whose children are born of that same twisted spiral? What families walk among us? Faces smiling, bloodlines snarled like knots behind the eyes. It's not hard to imagine in remote cabins, in cult compounds, in suburban homes where the curtains never open. The Crowthorne ideology, purity through collapse, closeness through cruelty, could still be breathing, whispered from father to daughter, taught through silence, pain, and lineage. You've passed men like this in grocery stores, women who never speak, children who never look up. You felt it in places that made your stomach turn for no reason, a chill that wasn't weather, a stare that lingered too long. That's the horror. Not that Elijah Crowthorne was a monster, but that he was a system, a design, a long and patient sickness disguised as family. And if you look back far enough into your own blood, if you peel away the names, the marriages, the migrations, you might find a gap, a missing year, a silent mother, a child born too soon to be explained. And you'll wonder, just for a second, what if the line passed through you, too? Because evil doesn't always vanish. Sometimes it just marries itself. If you made it this far, you weren't supposed to, but you did. Welcome to the archive.